Hello, everyone. Matt the Lester here, and back with another episode of our Terra Mystica Fan Factions Basic Strategy Series. As you probably know by now, we are going one by one through the new fan factions currently in beta testing on Board Game Arena and soon to be released as an official expansion for our favorite board game, Terra Mystica. And we're going through these factions one by one and talking about what they are, what they do, how to play them. So these videos are for you if you are familiar with the game of Terra Mystica, you've played a few games, you know the rules, you know the base factions, and you're looking to jump into a game on Board Game Arena, or maybe you have the new expansion, you're in the future, and you're looking to play one of these factions for the first couple times and want to learn what they're all about. So we're actually almost done with this series. So if this is the first video you're finding, like, go back and find the other ones. But this is the penultimate episode of at least the initial set of the base color fan factions. Fire and Ice factions and other videos TBD. But of the base color fan factions, we are on episode 13. And today we will be covering the Goblins. The Goblins are one of the two black fan factions alongside the Children of the Worm, who we covered in an earlier episode. The Goblins are super flexible, super fun, so this should be a really good one. As most of you know, I don't do video editing, I don't do animations, I don't have any fancy audio work, so this will be the no frills, one take Terra Mystica fan faction strategy overview of the Goblins. All right, let's go. So, Goblins, we mentioned, they are black. Let's first take a look at their board, and it is a mostly standard board, which is nice given some of the fan factions certainly have very non-standard boards. But the Goblins have pretty standard stuff: normal work production and dwellings, normal TP costs, normal TP production, with all their TPs giving 2 coins. They do have one small wrinkle on their temples. Temples are really good for Goblins, so they made them cost 1 coin more, so they cost 2 workers and 6 coins instead of the normal 5 coins, but not that big of a deviation. They produce normal priests, sanctuary, and stronghold, or the cheap varieties, 4 workers, 6 coins a piece, so pretty standard stuff here. Now, what you might be noticing, though, in the this area is that in addition to getting a favor tile when they build a temple, the Goblins get a special resource that only they can use called an X token. And this has to deal with their book ability down here, which we'll get to in just a second. Their stronghold also has to do with X tokens, so these things are what the Goblins are really all about. But before we get into X tokens, let's just cover the rest of the board. They are a 5/7 starting power faction, which is really nice. Thank you. Love normal starting 5/7 power factions. They have normal shipping costs, normal digging costs, start with normal resources, except they also start with 2 of these X tokens and a couple of cult steps. So all of that seems pretty straightforward, pretty standard, good stuff. So let's talk about the X tokens. The X tokens are the pieces in the box that normally you use to signify that a button has been taken. So you take double dig, and if you're actually playing in person, you put the little X token over the double dig icon to indicate that it has been used. But the Goblins have introduced a new mechanism where they actually use these as resources for themselves. So they start with 2 of them. They get 1 subsequently every time they build a sanctuary or a temple alongside the favor tile that they get from that build. And they can also get X tokens if after they have built their stronghold, they form a town. They also get an X token along with that town. Only if they've already have the stronghold or they form the town with the building of the stronghold do they get those X tokens. And these X tokens can, as an action, so this is the Goblin's book ability, be exchanged for some number of normal resources based on existing structures that the Goblins already have on the board. And when you do this, there are 4 options. You basically pick one type of structure. You can pick dwellings, TPs, temples, or big buildings. If you pick dwellings, you get 1 power 1 time for every dwelling you have on the board. So if you have 6 dwellings on the board, you exchange an X token and you immediately get 6 power advancement, just like you would if you had power income or something like that. If you pick TPs, you immediately get 2 coins for every TP you have on the board. So if you have 3 TPs on the board, you exchange your X token and you immediately get 6 coins. Temples are workers, 1-to-1. So say you have 2 temples on the board, you can exchange an X token for 2 workers. Or big buildings, you can exchange an X token and you get 1 cult step if you have your stronghold built, and or 2 cult steps if you have your sanctuary built. So potentially up to 3 cult steps for that X token. And so one thing that's really cool is that there are a variety of ways that you can use these X tokens, which allow for a very wide variety of game plans that the goblins can follow. They can build tall first, they can build out first, they can go a whole bunch of different ways and use these X tokens to supplement their income along the way. Additionally, these X tokens are really good, right? If you are able to exchange them at high levels of structure, you can get resources back equivalent. Basically, it's like a power action, right? If you exchange an X token when you have 2 temples on the board, you get 2 workers. That's taking the workers' power action. If you have 4 TPs on the board, you immediately get back 8 coins. It's better than the already amazing coins action. And so these X tokens really are resources. One of the keys to playing the goblins is to think of them as resources and use them along the way and use them in the game as you would any other resources. They just have this flexibility. They do have the slight downside that you have to take an action to make this exchange, which sometimes can screw up your tempo. Although sometimes it can help because you want to delay. So anyways, that's what the goblins are all about, are these X tokens, and the X tokens give the goblins a really, really good economy, but they don't have any inherent scoring on the board, as you see here. So playing the goblins well really requires, how do you snowball the economy that you get from these X tokens? How do you use all these resources to convert them into points? If you do that well, you're going to have a good game as the goblins. Okay, so that's how the goblins work. Let's talk about when we might want to play them. So start with the colors. Say it every episode, the color wheel matters. Especially on, and this is ground we've already covered before, but especially on base map, we know gray, a really great color to have in the game when you're playing black. They have a couple spots that neighbor each other and just give each other a ton of leash, so that's a really nice one. On the other hand, brown is probably black's worst enemy on base map, so that's the color you don't want to see in the game. The goblins are, I would say, medium level resilient to color neighbors. They do tend to spread out a lot. They have ability to kind of go in different places, so it's not like a color neighbor is going to completely ruin their game, but they also do like to found towns, especially in a game where they might want to build their stronghold, because those towns will give them more X tokens and enable them to snowball further. So they're also not completely resilient like Darklings, who basically don't actually care if they have a color neighbor. So goblins are probably somewhere in the middle on that front. When it comes to the bonus tiles, goblins, again, pretty flexible. I would say the most important tile for the goblins is the spade bonus tile. You might have noticed from the previous slide that goblins have no extra ability to get spades other than maybe exchanging X tokens for more power to potentially get power action spades, but in general that's not the most efficient use of those anyways. So the spade bonus tile being in the game is just really useful for the goblins who struggling to find spades early on particularly is kind of maybe one of their biggest weaknesses. So if that's in the game, great, and if it's out of the game, maybe watch out, not as good for the goblins. Beyond that, I threw the ship scoring tile here on the good because they do often expand their shipping early, especially on base map. We know that there's that nice you can connect 4 different hexes on the northern part of the map, which is 2 shipping on base map. So they often like to do that early. They often like to build temples early because temples are so good. They give them more of those X tokens, which means they also produce a lot of priests, and so therefore able to advance their shipping early. So put all this together, ship scoring tile, pretty good for the goblins. And I threw the 6 coin tile over on the bad side, not because it's like the goblins can't use it. They certainly can. Every faction loves coins. But the X token exchange on the TPs, where you can exchange an X token to get 2 coins for every TP, is one of the most common exchanges that you will make as the goblins, and enables the goblins to be a little more coin resilient than a lot of other factions. And so therefore, they can actually do pretty well in a low coin setup. Like, they won't score as much as they would in a higher coin setup, but everyone else would probably score even less on a relative basis. So that 6 coin tile being out of the game is good on a relative scale for the Goblins. So maybe something you don't want to see. When we talk about the track, we'll get into this in the openings in just a second. But I'm of the opinion that Double Temple is by far the most powerful opening for the Goblins, and they probably want to do it under most circumstances if they are able to. Therefore, having TP scoring and temple scoring in round one so that you're scoring while you build those couple temples is really good for the Goblins. So that's what I typically look for in round one. Beyond that, they're a pretty flexible faction, but again, they have a really strong economy and no inherent scoring. So they want as high of a scoring track as possible. And so that means town events, TP events, dwelling events in rounds 4, 5, and 6 in the late game. Once that economy has really snowballed, they have a ton of resources and they can just really hit hard the rounds that enable you to score a lot of points in a single round, which really are those three, TPs, dwellings, and towns. So that's what you're looking for is the Goblins. I also put round 4 digging on here because Goblins are often able to advance their digging just because they have so many resources that it often makes sense for them to do so. And so they can do quite well in round 4 digging games. On the bad side, the main thing I did was I threw the town round here in the early game simply because they're not a faction that's going to get a town in round 1 or round 2 or maybe even round 3. And some other factions are able to do so. And maybe more importantly, if there's a town round 1 or round 2, that means there isn't one in round 4, 5, or 6, which is when you really would want to see it as the Goblins. So that's maybe one thing that would be on the bad side for the Goblins. And I also threw temples on here in round 6 as they usually want to build a bunch of temples early in the game so they can get those X tokens and snowball them, which means they're not going to be able to hit a round 6 temple round well, really, if at all. And so that's just not where you want to see that event. You want to see that event ideally in round 1, if not then round 2. Or if it's not in the game at all, that's not the worst thing for Goblins, but in round 6, other people are going to be able to take advantage in a way that you're really not. But overall, Goblins are pretty flexible. Again, just like a high-scoring track is really all that matters. If you have a very low-scoring track where it's like, TP, big building to finish the game, and it's just like going to be really hard, that's not a scenario where the Goblins are going to do really well because they're just going to have a hard time converting that great economy that they have into a requisite number of points and beat out some factions maybe that have some inherent scoring. So that's what I would look for as the Goblins. All right, now we know when to play them. Let's talk about the map. Black on base map, as we've discussed previously, is one of the more flexible colors from a starting location perspective. There isn't that one hex that you always want to start on, and there's quite a number of starting positions that depend a little bit on the faction and a little bit on your neighbors and who else is in the game. So as the Goblins, I would say they follow some of the general rules that other black factions like the Darklings and the Alchemists follow of you want to look for neighbors and you usually want to start one in the east and one in the west. But which one those are depends a little bit on what you've got. So C1 in a typical Mend matchup or anything where you've got blue or yellow in the game is often very strong. E5, if there's going to be a lot of people in the middle, you usually want to pick one of those. And then on the Eastern continent, if you've got brown in the game and they're placing after you, maybe place your one in the west, let them place on the place that's away from them so that you can have access out. If maybe only red is in the game, go for E10. And then the other one is B5, which particularly Alchemists, who Goblins sort of do play a little bit like Alchemists in some ways. B5 can be a really good one for connection purposes, particularly if there's a blue faction in the game that's going to start on D5 or a green faction in the game that's going to play north. Starting on B5 is also totally works as Goblins, especially if you're going to get an early neighbor there and you're worried about connection. Because one of the ways that you turn great economy into points is via endgame scoring, via network, which you can't do if you don't connect. So that's also a really good starting spot for the Goblins. But again, it's just really dependent on who the other factions are in the game and where they're going to place. Look for neighbors and don't lose your connection. Okay, let's move on to the openings. This is where stuff gets fun and we really start to talk about the nuances of the Goblins and their ability. So I already mentioned that I think Double Temple is the best opening for the Goblins, and there's a couple reasons for this. The main reason is that they get more X tokens, and the X tokens are just more resources. So temples become the most economic building for the goblins in a way that they aren't for any other faction besides maybe the Chaos Magicians, who get a second favor tile, which is in some ways kind of like an X token. It's better. Favor tile is better than an X token, but they also only start with one building, and so they basically can't start double temple. They start sanctuary if they want to go double, but for the goblins, you can start double temple and you get more X tokens on top of the ones that you already have, which you can just further use to snowball your economy. So like, for example, if you build 2 temples, then an X token is essentially equal to 2 workers, which is like you took an extra couple copies of Earth 2, right? Like often one of the things you open double temple with many factions is then you're a little short on workers. You feel compelled to take Earth 2. You might need to find a workers action or a big building scoring tile or something like that to get more workers. But the goblins, you can use all these workers to make temples, and you instantly get resources that become more of those workers, and the snowball just keeps going. The other reason that double temple is really good is the same reason it's good for many factions, which is you can take an econ favor tile or 2, and you start producing priests, which are just really, really valuable, and especially for a faction like the goblins, who, based on their positioning on base map, priests can be ship advances and can allow you to expand and move around really well, and then potentially later in the game advance your digging. Also, throw some priests to cults. Priests are just good, and so the temples will allow you to get those. So, how do you do this as the goblins? Well, for the most part, you do it the same way as every other faction. You start with the normal 6 workers and 15 coins, which means you need to find 2 more workers, and in the case of the goblins, you do need to find a couple extra coins, because remember, their temples are 1 coin more than everybody else's. You need a total of 18 coins, but luckily, as the goblins, you already have those coins built in the form of the X tokens that you start the game with. So you just have to upgrade in the right order. So one of the reasons the double temple opening for the goblins is so amazing is because to build 2 temples, before you do that, you need to build 2 trading posts. And if you build both of your dwellings up into trading posts before you convert either of them to a temple, you can, before you build a temple, exchange an X token for 4 coins. You can even do this twice and get 8 coins and get a little bit of extra coins to use either that round or the next round, and then you can go ahead and upgrade into temples, get more X tokens, and then you have the temples up, and you can use those subsequent X tokens, the new ones, for workers. So this is one of the reasons this opening works so amazingly for goblins. You do still need 2 more workers to make this happen in the first place, because you don't want to exchange an X token for workers until you have 2 temples up, but you can't get 2 temples up without 2 more workers. So the best way to get 2 more workers is the big building bonus tile. So if you can get your hands on that, that's perfect. Then you need nothing else in order to do your double temple opening. Otherwise, the workers action is obviously there for you. You will need 1 more power than you start with, so you need a leech or take a power tile. Or of course, you can also do this with worker power, and then you can either still take a workers action or just do a single 3 power to worker conversion, and then you will have enough workers to do your double temple opening. Another amazing thing about the goblins, and the reason I wrote this as double temple plus, is because the goblins, with these subsequent resources that they get from the X tokens, can often actually do more than just double temple. So say, for example, that you get the spade bonus tile, and you're able to get the workers action. And then you do the thing where you upgrade the 2 TPs, you convert both of your initial X tokens to coins. So then, after you've built your 2 temples, you still have some coins left over, you still have this spade bonus tile, and you have 2 new X tokens. Well, exchange one of those X tokens for 2 workers, you have workers, you have coins, you have a spade, and you can build a dwelling. Maybe you can even build 2 dwellings if you get enough leech and you get the single spade action. So goblins can often do stuff on top of their temple. Then there is the super crazy opening, which I've only done once, and it didn't actually work that well the one time I did it, but I think there's potential, which is the goblins can actually open Sanctuary Temple, because those 2 extra X tokens that they get from the 2 temples can both be exchanged into workers. Now you have 4 workers. If you exchange both of your initial ones for coins, you have 5 coins. So all you need is 1 more power conversion down, and you actually could go ahead and build your sanctuary. Get, by the way, a 3rd favored tile and a 3rd X token, which you can use subsequently. Now, this is definitely going to limit what you can do in round 2, and by not expanding at all for a couple rounds, you're probably leaving yourself vulnerable. So I would only do this in select circumstances, maybe if you do have the big building tile, if it is a big building scoring round, worth potentially considering the sanctuary. But the fact that it's even possible really shows how crazy the goblins snowball. Like, they have a snowball within round 1, which is really something that no other faction can express. I also threw the priest action on here because, again, like, if you get the big building tile, you can build your 2 temples without doing anything else. So maybe you get a priest, you throw it to a cult, maybe it goes with one of the favorite tiles that you take. So when you do double temple, I would recommend 2 economic favorite tiles. That's my personal preference, but I also play very economic openings. If you think there's going to be a lot of competition for scoring favors, maybe it's a slightly lower scoring game, not that perfect high scoring track that you're really looking for with goblins, then taking Earth 1 with one of those favors is also perfectly reasonable. But taking any of Fire 1, Earth 2, Air 2, or honestly even Water 2, if there is a water reward in round 1, is really quite reasonable for the goblins, depending on what is going to be useful for them in round 2, depending on what you want to do in round 2, and what might be short in the game. You know, if it's a low coin game, we talked about how goblins are really resilient in low coin games. I would still go ahead and take Fire 1. You're still going to want those coins. But if maybe it's slightly going to be a lower worker game and Earth 2 looks good, or if there's some early Earth rewards. So sort of the normal considerations that you would have with the favorite tiles that you take from early double temples, without the I need to take Earth 2 because I'm going to be low on workers. Because for the most part, now that you have 2 temples up, you're going to use those first couple X tokens from those temples as workers, so you don't need to feel like you're super worker crunched. Now, you might want more workers. Maybe you want to advance your digs. Maybe it's round 4 digging game, so you end up taking Earth 2 anyways. But I wouldn't say that it's compulsory in the way that Earth 2 often feels for double temple openings for other factions. If you don't open double temple, and honestly, most of the time I would be recommending not opening double temple, only probably because you couldn't find the workers to do it. But if you don't want to do it, or maybe there's a dwelling scoring round, maybe there's a spade scoring round, goblins can also open like a more normal faction and do a single temple plus some dwellings. Maybe you get temp ship and the priest and you want to do a shipping opening. Maybe you're able to get double dig. So these are openings that are also available to the goblins, work just fine. The issue with them is that you don't have a natural way to use those X tokens super efficiently early in the game. So you're probably going to be saving them then more toward the mid game, and you can still explode and have them in the when you have them in the mid game, when you finally get all those TPs up and you turn 2 X tokens into 16 coins or something like that. Like, it's still really, they're still going to be useful. It just doesn't snowball quite as well. But if you have scoring opportunities or competitive hexes that you need to get with double spade or something like that, then totally reasonable opening for the goblins. I have definitely seen people open, temple 3 dwellings and win games. So that opening is available as well in sort of the standard ways that other factions do them. So with power tiles, spade actions. So also available to the goblins. Other than the weird sanctuary off a double temple opening, I don't think opening with a big building really ever makes sense for the goblins. The sanctuary is really too expensive under other circumstances. Plus, like, opening just sanctuary dwelling, like, why would you not take the extra temple? And the stronghold really is more of a mid to late game stronghold because it only gives you bonuses when you form towns. And so opening with it doesn't really usually make a lot of sense. If you can find a dwelling rush, go for it, but that's quite tricky on base map as black in general. So I think most of your openings are going to be in the temples and dwellings wheelhouse. And again, temples are just so good for goblins because they give you X tokens in addition to favor tiles. So you do really want to prioritize building them early. All right. So now we've opened, we're rolling, our snowball is going. How do we convert that into a good rest of the game for the goblins and hopefully a victory? So we already talked a little bit about this in the opening section, but don't be afraid to use your X tokens. I think some people, when they first play the goblins, they're like, oh, it's such a waste to use one if I'm not getting the full 8 coins or 3 workers from 3 temples. But those resources are really more valuable early in the game. So don't be afraid to use them if they allow you to build something that's gonna reproduce and keep you allowing you to build your snowball. But sometimes that does mean thinking about your upgrade order or your build order. So just how we talked about building both TPs before you build a temple so you can take advantage of the coin conversion in round 1. Things like that will happen along the game as you go too, especially with TPs where you want to have as many of them standing as you're going to have in a round at any given point so you can maximize that conversion maybe before you pull one back off the board. So just think about that. We also said that the X token to 8 coins, particularly in the mid to late game, is really, really powerful, or even 6 coins for 3 TPs on the board. So in a little bit of a counter to point 1, while definitely don't be afraid to use your X tokens through the mid game, highly recommend keeping at least one around if you're looking forward and there's a TP round in round 4 or TP round in round 5 and you're thinking, oh, that's the round where I'm going to build 3 or 4 TPs and try to score them a lot. Make sure you're still holding on to 1 X token so that after you do that, you can convert it to a bunch of coins and keep your snowball going. It's just a really powerful tool, and if you use all of your X tokens early, especially if then you don't have any subsequent, temples or sanctuary, the resources for them, you're going to be really sad when you don't have that X token. Plus, especially if you need an X token to convert to coins, you have to build a temple that takes a TP off board, which reduces that X token, so it's much better to hold on to at least one. Mentioned this too, but goblins, again, tons of resources, so advancing digs is often good. You usually will have the priests. You often can even create more workers from exchanging X tokens, so definitely sort of think about that in the early game planning. Hey, I might be able to advance my digs later in the game, and that'll enable me to dig out some towns. It will relieve some of your thinking about early hex pressure a little bit. I would say just build up, get as much stuff out as possible, get your natural black hexes, and don't be afraid to advance your digs later. Even if you have to do a double dig or even a triple dig to find that town space, that's often a more efficient way to build as goblins than to go out of your way, be inefficiently grabbing hexes right next to your starting hexes. And then the stronghold, sorry. It is definitely a situational stronghold because it depends on how many towns you're going to build and when you're going to build them. You probably want to score it when you play it, either having the big building tile or a big building scoring tile or both. But if you're going to build 3 towns late in the game and you can build the stronghold first, it can be really strong. For example, if you get 3 X tokens back off of it, it will pay for itself most likely. You can exchange one of those for 8 coins and a couple of them for some workers, and bam, there's all the resources that you put into that stronghold, and hopefully you got contribution toward a town, freed up a TP, scored it, right? All the things that strongholds are normally good for. That said, if you're only going to get 1 X token off of it, or sometimes even 2, it might not be worth it. It just kind of depends on what you're going to get out of it, but like using it alone in like round 6 to finish a town, just that you're going to get 1 X token back, you probably have a more efficient way to do that town. So make sure you're doing that calculus in your head. When we think about end game scoring, goblins, huge economy. So we said end game scoring is going to be big. Network, they're generally a very high network faction. The reason I have the high dash low here is that black on base map does sometimes have connection issues. And so That's one of the ways that it can be a problem, and maybe they don't. But if they don't connect, then they probably won't score a lot of network points. So that's where the load comes in. I have also seen a couple like tall Goblins games that can work very well. What they usually involve is building both big buildings and using multiple X tokens toward the end of the game to advance high on the cults and score in-game scoring that way. I think it's a much trickier way to play them, but I have seen it done very successfully. So they could be low network, higher cults, or they can be high network, in which case they're probably lower cult because they've probably spent most of both their X tokens and priests, which are the two ways that they're going to get cult steps. They've spent them early in the game on more expansion. So I guess cults really should be like low high, not medium. But it's kind of the same thing, and often with the Goblins, there's a bit of a trade off there. But there can also be games sometimes where they can be high on both. Like, it's certainly possible too. So, anyways, overall, very robust faction, I would say, on the stronger side of the fan factions. Probably one of the trickier ones to master, just because turning a really, really strong economy into a good number of points is not always the easiest thing to do in Terra Mystica. You have to sort of really think about when you're building things, and then the Goblins have this extra complication of when do I upgrade, what do I exchange my X tokens for, when do I do it, sort of maximizing and being optimally efficient with all of those resources and all of these extra resources in the form of X tokens can be difficult, but when done well is really, really strong. And I've seen the Goblins have some absolutely amazing games when they're able to make it all come together on a high scoring track with high scoring bonus tiles and all of that. So definitely play the Goblins. They are very fun. You will probably at some point play a game against them where they absolutely blow you out of the water, and you'll be like, oh my god, these guys are amazing. And then you'll probably play a game with or against them, and they will struggle and just not be able to convert this economy into points. So they have a big variety, but they're super fun to play. So please go play them. Come find me on BGA or in the comments. Let me know how your games with them are going. Let me send me some links to some cool lines. Like they're a faction that you can see some really wild lines. So I'm really hoping to see some cool stuff from y'all. And that'll be it for today. But we'll be back very soon. It's going to be this week because Terra Mysticon is in 2 weeks, and I want to get all of these out before the fan factions tournament. There is one faction left after this one. Probably my favorite fan faction, the Dinian Gefir, the Goats. They are so cool. And so we will be back with them. But until then, hope you all enjoyed this. And yes, go play the Goblins and have some fun. And we'll see you all there.